Good morning, 8th grade. It is Mr. Frazier, and it's Wednesday, April 15th, and this is your history lecture for the day and possibly the week. Report cards, just a few announcements. Report cards should be coming out very soon. We have a test this Friday for science. Um, I'm not really going to be making a study guide, number one, because at this point it's a little late, but number two, you have your books, you're at home, like you have all the time in the world. So take your time, do your best on it. If you have questions, let me know. You can call me in the middle of the test, or whatever you think. Um, if you are having trouble turning in assignments or seeing anything, please contact me. I'm always available. We got to get through all this nonsense. Hopefully, we'll be back in school by the end of the year. If not, then I will do everything in my power to make the trip to Washington, D.C. happen. Go in the summer, go next year. I don't care. I want to make it happen for you guys if I can. Anyways, it's going to be kind of a long lecture today, so let's dive right in. So we've been talking about the English monarchy, and we talked about the Plantagenets, right? There's John and Richard and all of the rest of them, Henry, um, and we talked about the War of the Roses, where the Plantagenets lost the throne to the Tudors, Tudors, and the first Tudor monarch is Henry VII, who becomes king after defeating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. And Henry VII is kind of forgotten often because of his famous son, Henry VIII, who had all of those many wives. Um, and, people are interested in all of those, titillating little things, the secrets and the affairs and all of that. And so Henry VIII kind of is the most famous king in history. Um, but today we're talking about his children. Now, Henry VIII is not only important because he had this, crazy love life, but also because he makes a number of decisions that affect the church and the state based on his love life. So remember, the main reason that he makes England a Protestant country is not because he disagrees with Catholicism. He actually is, the defender of the faith. But he does it to get a divorce. But remember, with the king, every personal issue is also a political issue. So cheating on your husband is just kind of something that you shouldn't do. Cheating on the king means you get your head chopped off. So um, every aspect of his personal life affects the country and the kingdom as a whole. So the things we're going to be talking about today when we talk about his children, are not only the policies, the things that they did, the laws that they passed, but also their religion. And their religion lines up with the religion of their mothers. So let's dive right in. First, we have Edward VI, Henry's son, the person that he was fighting so hard for, right? Ruined his first marriage and uh, tore the kingdom apart and broke with the Pope and all of that because he believed that he needed a son. Which is ironic, we'll see, because he didn't need a son and all of this was for nothing. But Henry VIII felt like he needed a son, and so he moved heaven and earth, and he finally gets it. Edward VI is born from his third wife, Jane Seymour. And Jane's a Protestant, and Henry VIII is a Protestant at this point, so his son, Edward VI, is a Protestant. Now, it's important to remember that Edward VI was a sickly child. And remember, this is before inoculations and, EpiPens and all of that. So, Edward VI is born sickly. Now, I don't know exactly what that means, I'm not a doctor. But Henry VIII dies, and Edward VI, his son, becomes king when he's 9 years old. And he dies when he's 16. So, sickly meant something. But for that 7 years he reigns, he's very devout. Now, that could be because he knew that he was going to die soon, and so religion becomes that much more important. But it could also mean because, he is a product of Henry VIII's divorce and all of the things that went because of that. So he is a firm Protestant. Now, it's hard to know how much did this young boy uh, actually do, right? How much can a 14-year-old, no offense, change the country? If somebody made one of the eighth graders the president, would they have the wherewithal to change economic policy? Well, the people back then didn't think so, so he has his group of helpers, the archbishops and the privy council that's made up of Thomas Cranmer and Latimer and Ridley, and they are true Protestants. Now remember, have a sip of coffee. Remember when Henry VIII changes England's official religion from Catholicism to Protestantism or Anglicanism, he doesn't really change that much, right? He has the 6 articles, and that basically keeps the Roman Catholic Church in place. The only difference is instead of the Pope being in charge, the King's in charge. So when he did that, he kind of cheesed off a bunch of people. The Catholics were obviously upset because they were no longer allowed to be Catholic. But many of the Protestants were also upset because they felt like you did all of this and you didn't really change anything. So Cranmer, Ridley, and Latimer, and Edward VI all want the Protestant movement to be worth something. So they introduce new laws like the 42 Articles and the Book of Common Prayer that make Anglicanism look more like Lutheranism. I don't know if any of this is making sense, but Anglicanism under Henry VIII was still basically Catholicism. There was still all the vestments, the fancy clothes, and everything was the same. They even had like the priest outfits. There's just the change at the top. Under Edward VI, England's church becomes more Protestant, splits further away from Catholicism, and that's on purpose. And that's what Edward VI and his homies, Cranmer, Ridley, and Latimer, wanted. But, like we said, Edward VI, poor young guy, he dies at 16. And his older sister becomes queen, Mary the First. And there she is. And Mary is the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. And she was, grown up enough, she was probably around your age, when all of the stuff between her parents went down. So she saw her father kick her mother to the curb. She saw him change the religion of England so that he could marry this new lady. Imagine how upset you would be. Now imagine that it's back in the Middle Ages and your mom was just sent off basically to die in a coven by herself. Not a coven, sorry, in a convent. So she was understandably upset, and she remains devoutly Catholic. And when she becomes queen, she tries to change the whole thing around. She marries the Prince of France. France is Catholic. She kicks out Hugh Latimer and the rest of those guys, and tries to make England Catholic again. But at this point, the inertia of the Protestant movement has already moved too far. It's been, decades of Protestantism now. And so people are resisting going back to Catholicism. But so Mary, now that she's queen, she has power. And so she starts to persecute these people who refuse to accept Catholicism. Now, she wasn't any worse than Henry VIII or most of the medieval kings. That's, in the Middle Ages, the king got what they wanted, or the queen, and if you didn't do what they wanted, then you got tortured or killed. You got, poor ladies getting their heads cut off because they get divorced. So it's not necessarily that Mary the First was so terrible. She gets that famous nickname, Bloody Mary, because of a guy named John Fox. He was a Protestant guy, and obviously he didn't like Mary. And so he writes this book called the Book of Martyrs, where he lists and catalogs in graphic detail everything that Mary is doing. And it's really throwing shade on her in a way that is disproportionate. So Henry VIII boiled dudes alive. Like, he killed two of his wives. He had countless people tortured and hanged to death. But he doesn't get called bloody anything. Mary gets called Bloody Mary, and we still think of Bloody Mary, say it in the bathroom at midnight 3 times, or the alcoholic drink Bloody Mary. People still know this name hundreds of years later. And it's kind of a bad rap because, was she a nice lady? No. Did she kill people because of religion? Yes. But she didn't do much more, in my opinion, than other kings and queens of her time. But her whole reign is kind of a disaster. She's trying to fit a square Catholic peg into a round Protestant hole. And England has turned far enough. There's still plenty of Catholics there, but the government apparatus is Anglican now. I mean, she's supposed to be the head of the church. She's the monarch. So she has kind of a few years, 5 years of tumultuous reign. She gets sick, like her mother, unfortunately, with cancer. Her husband, the Prince of France, kind of just bounces pieces out back to France, leaves her alone, and she dies. She's buried and quickly just forgotten, and they move on. It's kind of sad, but the problem was her younger sister is going to be so awesome. And her younger sister is, of course, Elizabeth the First. Now, Elizabeth the First is an anomaly. She is, there aren't very many queens in the Middle Ages, but there are two absolutely fantastic queens, Elizabeth the First of England and Catherine the Great of Russia. And Elizabeth the First is kind of such a good monarch that she gets her own age. They say the Elizabethan age, and she part of this is because she ruled well. She made good decisions. She was also unique. She was unusual. She refused to get married, which in the 1500s was a big deal. Women were expected to get married and have babies. And Elizabeth did neither of those things. She refused to get married. She always pretended like she was going to get married, but then would find some reason for not doing it. Many of those reasons were valid. But so in an era when women had almost no rights, Elizabeth ruled the way that she wanted to. She knew that if she married somebody, that her husband, the king, would start making all of the decisions and she would be kind of relegated to the back seat. And so she stays unmarried. So they call her the Virgin Queen because back then women were only expected to have sex for kids and in the context of marriage. And so since she was never married and never had kids, she was the Virgin Queen. And later, when she starts the policy of colonizing the New World, the first English colony, Virginia, is named after her. And, this term that English people were proud of her, like, our pure, holy queen. That was the attitude at the time. She was so liked, she had another nickname called Good Queen Bess. Obviously, nobody ever called her Bess to her face. It was like a term of endearment. Like instead of calling somebody Robert, calling him Bobby or something. Good Queen Bess. But it's under Elizabeth's role that we see kind of England become a global power. And as famous as her father, Henry VIII, is, Elizabeth kind of brings England from this backwater country into a modern global superpower. She ruled for 45 years. That's a long time. That's not how long she was alive, that's how long she was queen. And that helps establish England as a Protestant country because she was Protestant. Her mother, obviously, was Anne Boleyn, the first of Henry's wives to be executed. And, anyways, let's talk about Queen Elizabeth's reign. Now, things are going to get a little complicated. Make sure that you're listening to these videos, but that you're also reading. So the Elizabethan age, one of the most famous parts of Elizabethan age is this guy, William Shakespeare. So not only did Elizabeth set out new colonies like Virginia, but she was interested in the arts. She has many portraits painted of her, but she also indulged in this new type of entertainment called theater. And you would have what were called players, not actors, who would travel around putting on shows. William Shakespeare is the most famous of these authors. In fact, he is so good that some people think that it couldn't be just one man who's written all these things. His plays are so famous. There's Othello, there's Hamlet, there's Romeo and Juliet, there's Macbeth. He wrote sonnets and poems, and people would all go and watch his plays at a theater called the Globe Theater. It got burned down hundreds of years ago, but they rebuilt it a little while ago. And people would go and watch Shakespearean plays. There were other actors and writers, and people would go and kind of see this. And so it's kind of a modern take. Back during the Middle Ages, people weren't going to watch plays, right? They were just living in the dirt. And so this is kind of a new idea that people would go and watch something for fun, for enjoyment. Another problem with Elizabeth's reign we are going to see is that around this time, the Protestant Reformation has spread, and different countries have chosen to be either Protestant or Catholic. We talked about it when we were still in class with the 30 Years' War. So certain countries like Denmark, Sweden, parts of Germany were Protestant. But then there were most countries, Spain, France, Portugal, Italy, or parts of Italy, right, that were very much Catholic. And so that added a new dimension to politics. So Philip II, the King of Spain, does not like England, and he certainly does not like Elizabeth. He dislikes her as a queen, right? She is a woman doing a man's job, ruling a country. He does not like her as a person. She is the daughter of Anne Boleyn, this hated woman in Catholic Spain, right? Both of his relatives, Catherine and Mary, were kind of pushed to the side for her and her mother and father. And so Philip II holds a big time grudge. All right, dynastic challenges. Not only did she have to deal with Catholic Spain snooping around, but even her own cousin up in Scotland. This is where it gets even more complicated. There is another Mary. Her name is Mary Stuart, or Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, this is not Mary the First. This is a different Mary. They were cousins. Most of the kings and queens were related at some point. And Mary, Queen of Scots, is Catholic. She was supposed to marry Edward VI, Elizabeth's younger brother. But Edward was Protestant, and guys like Cardinal David Beaton and other men around Mary Stuart wanted Scotland to stay Catholic. So they had Mary marry a Catholic prince. And that was going well, but the Catholic prince backed out. So Mary Stuart was kind of left alone. Now, there were Catholics in England who wanted Elizabeth out and Mary Stuart in. And so they started plotting. In fact, there's more than one assassination attempt on Elizabeth. In fact, one time she's coming out of her prayer study chapel, and a man steps out of the hall with a pistol, and he aims it at her, and he pulls the trigger, and he would have shot her dead right then when she was just a relatively young woman, but he didn't load the pistol correctly, and it misfires, and so it just kind of clicks the hammer, and as he's trying to reload it, he's, wrestled down and then obviously tortured and murdered. But so now Elizabeth has a problem because she knows that Mary Stuart, her cousin, the Queen of Scotland, is a Catholic, and she's reasonably sure that Mary is plotting to kill her. However, she is, number one, her cousin, her family, and number two, Mary is a queen. You can, murder, assassinate, behead common people, but royals are normally not executed. But it's found out that Mary directly had a hand in trying to overthrow Elizabeth and become the Queen of England and Scotland. And so, unfortunately, Elizabeth has to sign the death warrant, and Mary is arrested and is beheaded. Whoops. Poor Mary. Scottish Reformation. Now, like we were just talking about, Scotland was Catholic, and there were many Scottish Protestants who wanted to change that. Most notably, this guy with his fabulous beard. And that guy is named John Knox. John Knox is the leader of the Scottish Reformation, and he was always kind of bad-mouthing Mary Stuart because he sees her as kind of the Catholic, Bloody Mary for England, but for Scotland. And so he is constantly trying to set up a Scottish Protestant church. When Mary is executed, or she's arrested and she's sent to England. When that happens, her son becomes the new king, and his name is James the Sixth. I know this is all complicated, and everybody's named the same thing. But James the Sixth, her son, becomes the King of Scotland. Next week, after we are finished talking about Elizabeth, when she dies, James the Sixth of Scotland becomes King of Scotland and England. But at this point, he's just a young boy, and he becomes James the Sixth of Scotland. Meanwhile, John Knox sets up the Scottish Presbyterian Church. Remember, all of these names, Anglican, Lutheran, Presbyterian, they're all Protestant. They're all basically not Catholic. So there's Catholic, and then there's everything else. If you're not Catholic at this point, you are Protestant. Realpolitik. That's a fancy word for the politics of international kind of espionage. And so during all of this time, there is, moving, there's positioning, there's scheming, there's plotting, and all of it has to do with Protestant versus Catholic. So we got Charles V right there to the right with his fancy leggings and codpiece, who is the Habsburg Emperor. And remember, the Habsburgs are the most powerful monarchs. They rule Spain. They rule much of the New World. They rule parts of the Netherlands. And Charles V gives the Netherlands to his son, Philip II of Spain. Now, Holland, or the Netherlands, or the people who live there are called Dutch, are mostly Protestant. And Charles V and Philip II are extremely Catholic. And so the Dutch don't like being part of the Habsburg Empire, and they try to fight for their freedom. And so Philip II decides that he's going to force the Dutch to be Catholic. So he sends in the Duke of Alva. The Duke of Alva is that guy in the super gold clothing there. And the Duke of Alva led the Spanish army, which was extremely strong, and kind of really does a number on the Dutch people. And it is a brutal, brutal war. You could be arrested, charged, and hanged without any trial. They just find a tree and basically lynch these people. And it's a bad scene. It's a bloody conflict that goes on for years and years and years. The Spanish government, excuse me, the Spanish government in Holland is called the Council of Blood. They didn't give themselves that name, obviously, but they're called the Council of Blood by the Dutch people because so many people are dying. Finally, there is a Dutch hero. His name is William the Silent, and he is the Duke of Orange. That's like a territory. Even today, if you go to the Netherlands, there is a Duke of Orange, and one of their symbols, like if you ever see like the Olympics, the Dutch always have orange uniforms on. And that's because William the Silent manages to lead a Dutch force that defeats the Spaniards and kicks them out. This is a famous painting where William the Silent there is holding Duke of Alva's arm and pointing like, "Get out of here, you Spanish, we're going to be free." And so he's seen as the father of his country, kind of like George Washington for us. And he sets up the Dutch Republic. He also establishes the Dutch Reformed Church, which was Protestant. So, I know that's all a mouthful, but what you need to get from this is that there's another war between a Catholic country, Spain, and a Protestant country, the Netherlands. The Netherlands wins, and there is more religious conflict like we've been talking about this entire time. Speaking of Protestant and Catholic conflict, we have the Anglo-Spanish conflict. So we've talked about this already, so I'll try and make it a little short. Spain and England already didn't like each other. Spain was richer and more powerful. And when the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, marries the Prince of England, first Arthur and then Henry VIII, it's really seen as a good move for England. They're definitely marrying up. And things go well. England, Henry VIII and Catherine, love each other for years, but things start to go south when, number one, Henry VIII divorces Catherine. Now, back in the Middle Ages, like I've said, this was a big deal for anybody to get divorced. But for the Queen to get divorced was just like, oh man, it was the most kind of insulting thing that could have been done. And the Spanish kings, particularly Philip II, could never, ever, ever, I think he was her nephew, could never forgive England for this. And so there's a grudge there. That's problem number one. Then, when Mary is kind of treated so disdainfully, also a relative of Philip II. That's another problem that the Spanish don't like. Then, when Elizabeth, the hated daughter of the hated Anne Boleyn, becomes queen, she does a number of things that further upset the Spanish. Now, at this point, the Spanish are making so much money off of the New World. The New World, obviously, is Central, South America, and North America. So, Spain is sending conquistadors and priests, all through Mexico and South America, but up into Florida and California, and they claim all the New World. And so they are not happy when Elizabeth starts sending English settlers into North America to establish Virginia. Like, hey man, this is all our stuff. You can't have any of this stuff. So there's another problem that they have. Then, the other problem is that the Spanish flat out don't like England because they're Protestant. Right? There's that divide between religions, Protestant versus Catholic. And then lastly, kind of the tipping point is that Queen Elizabeth secretly starts sending pirates to raid Spanish shipping. Now, she officially, I'm using air quotes you can't see, denies any involvement. But these English pirates will sail to the Caribbean, right? If you've ever seen any of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, they sail to the Caribbean, they raid the Spanish towns, they take the Spanish gold, and then they hide in English ports. Not only that, they were expected, this was all clandestine, they were expected to give Elizabeth 80% of all of the stuff they took. So let's say that you robbed $100,000 worth of gold from Spain. You got to keep $20,000 yourself, and then you give $80,000 to Elizabeth. The most famous of these sea dogs is a guy named Sir Francis Drake. Now, if we were still in class together, I would give you a whole thing on Sir Francis Drake. He's actually extremely interesting. He circumnavigated the globe. He sold all around the world. He sacked a whole city of Panama. He laid siege to the Spanish port city of Cadiz. He fought in the against the Spanish Armada. He's a very interesting guy, but we don't have time for him. But he is one of these, the Spanish call him the English sea dogs. He's like a pirate that's working for the crown. Now, Elizabeth knows that with all of this stuff that the Spanish are going to come looking to fight England. And so England at this point, during the late 1500s, doesn't have much of a navy. So she hires this guy named John Hawkins and says, you got to start building a fleet. And that's what John Hawkins does. What she doesn't know is that Philip II has decided he's had enough of England. He clears a whole forest and he builds the mightiest fleet that Europe had seen up to that point. Hundreds of ships, thousands of soldiers. And he's planning to sail to England, wipe out their puny fleet, invade the country, topple the government, and establish a Catholic country. And that's what he does. He's heading over there, but two things happen that change history forever. Number one is a storm kicks up. And this storm does a number on the Spanish fleet. It spreads it around, right? This is a time when there's no motors, so everybody's just using sails and wind. So when a big storm blows all your ships around, it's hard to concentrate your fire. And number two, the English fleet is smaller, but it's more maneuverable. And they use special tactics. They would send small boats, set them on fire, and kind of just point them at Spanish ships. And they are able to defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588. And it's a huge, huge victory. The Spanish, this mighty, powerful country, had just lost in the Netherlands. now they got their teeth kicked in by the English Navy, and the rest of the Spanish fleet that had not been sunk or blown away is trying to sail around Scotland to get back to Spain. And another storm kicks up and smashes the fleet against the rocks. And so it is this utter debacle. And the Protestants, mainly in England, say, see, God's on our side. You evil Catholics, you tried to send your fleet to crush us, and God sent this storm to smite you. And they see it as God's providence for England, that he favors England and Protestantism. Now, I know that was a whole big old deal. I hope you're able to make it through all of that. I hope you guys are doing well. Please remember that if you have questions, you can contact me. I hope you all picked up your books so that you have your test booklets for Friday. Anyways, can't wait till all this is over. I'm praying for you, and looking forward to when we meet again and when we're going to Washington, D.C. All right, have a great day, guys.